I thought the ghost stories were exactly what every summer camp had. Something the older campers made up to scare everyone else. I stopped laughing about them the first night I woke up to someone humming outside my tent. This happened when I was 15. It was my first time going to a week-long summer camp, and I'd spent weeks looking forward to it. The camp sat in the middle of a huge forest, with rows of canvas tents set up near a lake, and hiking trails disappearing into the trees in every direction. During the day, it was beautiful. At night, once the campfire burned down and everyone returned to their tents, the woods felt endless. On the first evening, after dinner, all the campers gathered around the fire while some of the older kids started telling ghost stories. Most of them sounded ridiculous, but there was one rumor they all seemed to agree on. According to them, ghosts wandered the campgrounds after midnight. Nobody described them the same way. One person swore they looked like campers who had gotten lost years ago. Another claimed they only appeared between the trees where the firelight couldn't reach. Someone else insisted you never actually saw them at all. You only heard them walking or singing somewhere outside your tent. The details kept changing, but every version ended with the same warning. If you hear footsteps or someone singing after midnight, don't leave your tent. I remember thinking it was a clever way to keep younger campers from sneaking around after curfew. That first night I fell asleep almost immediately. Sometime later I woke up for no obvious reason. At first I thought the sound was part of a dream. It was humming, very soft, a woman's voice. The melody was slow and almost comforting, like a lullaby I'd heard years ago but couldn't quite remember. I stayed perfectly still, listening. The humming drifted from one side of my tent to the other, then it stopped. A few seconds later, I heard footsteps circling my tent as if to scare me. I remember staring at the ceiling of my tent, trying to convince myself it had to be another camper trying to scare people. I almost unzipped the entrance to look outside, but something stopped me. I don't know if it was fear or common sense, but I stayed exactly where I was until the footsteps faded into the woods. The next morning, I casually asked the people in my tent if anyone had been outside after lights out. Everyone looked confused. Nobody admitted to it. Later that morning, one of the counselors reminded everyone that they had checked each tent before going to bed and again just after midnight. As far as they knew, every camper had stayed inside. I didn't mention the humming. It sounded too ridiculous once the sun was up. The second day was completely normal. We swam in the lake, went canoeing, hiked through the woods, and spent the evening making s'mores around the campfire. The ghost stories came up again, but this time I didn't laugh as much. I kept thinking about the humming. That night I stayed awake longer than everyone else. I wanted to prove to myself I'd imagined it. Around 2:30, it started again. The same melody. Faint enough that I couldn't tell exactly where it was coming from. This time it sounded farther away, for almost a minute. Then it slowly became louder, closer. The footsteps followed, one slow step after another. The sound stopped directly outside my tent. I held my breath. The humming stopped too. Everything went completely silent. No wind, no insects, nothing. It felt like someone was standing only a few feet away, listening for movement inside. I don't know how long I stayed frozen, but eventually the footsteps continued toward the woods until I couldn't hear them anymore. I barely slept. The next morning, it had rained just before sunrise. The ground around our tents was soft and muddy. While everyone packed up for breakfast, I noticed something near the entrance of my tent. Footprints, just one trail, and they came from the direction of the woods. Stopped a few feet in front of my tent, then turned around and went back the way they came. I pointed them out to one of the counselors. He smiled and said they probably belonged to another camper who had wandered around before the rain ended. Except the footprints were on top of the fresh mud. Whoever made them had walked there after the storm. Nobody else seemed interested. I tried letting it go. That afternoon, another camper quietly asked if I'd heard anything strange during the night. I didn't want to influence his answer, so I just shrugged. He hesitated before admitting he'd woken up because he thought someone had been singing somewhere near the lake. He'd assumed he was dreaming. Neither of us told anyone else. The following night, I was too nervous to fall asleep. The camp seemed different after midnight. The laughter from the evening was gone. The fire had turned to glowing embers. Even the frogs near the lake had gone quiet. I kept watching the faint outline of my tent through the moonlight. Then the humming returned. Only this time it wasn't moving. It stayed in one place, close enough that I could hear every rise and fall of the melody. I slowly reached for the zipper. My hand stopped halfway. I don't know why. Something deep inside me was telling me that if I looked outside, I'd regret it, so I didn't. Instead, I listened. After a minute, the humming faded. The footsteps followed, walking away, one slow step at a time. The next morning, I finally worked up the courage to tell one of the counselors everything. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he didn't laugh. He simply asked if I'd gone outside. When I said no, he nodded once and told me I'd made the right choice. He never explained what he meant. The rest of the week passed without anything else happening. No humming, no footsteps. By the time camp ended, I'd almost convinced myself exhaustion had made me imagine everything. But every now and then, usually when it's very late and the house is quiet, I remember that humming. And what still bothers me isn't that I never saw who was outside my tent. It's that, after all these years, I still remember the melody perfectly. I just can't remember where I learned it. I wish we'd never left our cabin and followed the rules, because sneaking out into the woods that night still haunts me. This happened in August of 2023 at a summer camp in northern Michigan. We spent an entire week rolling our eyes at the older counselors whenever they warned us not to wander into the woods after lights out. They never explained why. They'd just smile, tell us to stay on the paths, and change the subject. By the sixth night, the five of us decided we were going to prove the stories were nothing more than campfire nonsense. The camp was surrounded by dense pine forest with a network of hiking trails that stretched for miles. During the day, they were beautiful. At night, they became something else entirely. Once you stepped beyond the last cabin, the only light came from our flashlights and the moon filtering through the branches. The air smelled like damp earth and pine needles, and every little sound carried farther than it should have. We waited until everyone was asleep before climbing out through the cabin window. The plan was simple. Walk to the old memorial clearing, stay for 5 minutes, take a picture to prove we'd been there, then sneak back before anyone noticed we were gone. The memorial was for a camper named Evan. According to the story we'd all heard that week, he disappeared during a night hike more than 30 years earlier. Search teams looked for him for days, but they never found a single trace. Some campers claimed they still heard someone walking through the woods at night. Others said they heard their names whispered if they stayed out too late. Nobody actually believed it. At least that's what we kept telling ourselves. The walk to the clearing took about 20 minutes. The deeper we went, the quieter everything became. Even the insects seemed to disappear. Our flashlights bounced between the trees, catching twisted branches that looked almost like people until the light moved on. When we reached the clearing, there wasn't much to see. Just a weathered wooden bench, a small stone with Evan's name engraved on it, and an oak tree growing beside the marker, covered with faded friendship bracelets and old ribbons left behind by former campers. The place felt strangely untouched. One of my friends laughed and started making jokes about the ghost stories we'd heard all week. Another one called out Evan's name into the darkness. Nothing happened. We laughed even harder. A few seconds later, someone called his name again. Longer this time. The sound echoed through the trees before fading into silence. We stood there waiting. Then I heard it. Not his name. Mine. It wasn't loud, it wasn't shouted. It sounded like someone standing just behind my left shoulder, saying my name in a voice so quiet, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. Every hair on my arm stood up. Before I could even turn around, I felt something brush lightly across my shoulder. It felt exactly like fingertips. I spun around so fast I nearly dropped my flashlight, but there was nobody there, only darkness. My flashlight swept across tree trunks, bushes, and empty ground. Nothing. The others started laughing, assuming one of them had scared me. Except they were all standing in front of me. None of them had been close enough to touch me. I tried telling myself a branch must have brushed against me. The problem was there weren't any branches hanging that low. I didn't mention hearing my name. I figured they'd think I was trying to scare them back. We decided to head towards camp. The walk back felt completely different. Nobody joked anymore. We all stayed close together, our flashlights crossing over one another as we hurried down the trail. A few minutes into the hike, I noticed one of my friends had stopped talking entirely. He kept glancing over his shoulder every few seconds. When I asked if he was okay, he nodded a little too quickly. We kept walking. Another 5 minutes passed before he quietly admitted he'd heard someone whisper too. Not his name, just a whisper. He couldn't make out the words. He thought it had come from somewhere off the trail. That was enough to make everyone uncomfortable. The pace picked up. Nobody said another word. About halfway back, I became aware of footsteps following behind. Whenever we stopped, they stopped. Whenever we started walking again, they came back. At first, I blamed the sound on echoes. Then one of the others suddenly turned around and swept his flashlight into the woods. Just rows of pine trees disappearing into darkness. The footsteps stopped. We waited, listening closely for any sound, but nothing came. The moment we started walking again, they returned. This time everyone heard them. We didn't run. We just walked faster, pretending none of us were scared. Then my flashlight flickered. I smacked it against my palm. The beam came back. 10 seconds later, another flashlight went out completely. Then another. By the time we reached the edge of camp, only one flashlight was still working. We climbed back through the cabin window without waking anyone. Nobody slept much that night. The next morning, while everyone was getting ready for breakfast, one of my friends realized his flashlight was missing. We searched our cabin, the trail outside, the clearing, but we couldn't find it. We figured it had fallen somewhere in the woods. The counselors organized a search later that afternoon. We never found it. What we did find was something stranger. On our way back from the search, we passed the memorial clearing again. One of the younger campers pointed towards the oak tree. His flashlight was hanging from one of its lowest branches. The same flashlight we'd spent hours looking for was hanging neatly by its wrist strap, almost as if someone had carefully placed it there. None of us admitted we'd gone to the clearing the night before. The counselors assumed another camper had found it. The problem was, no one else had been allowed anywhere near that part of the woods all day. I have tried convincing myself that it was my imagination messing with me. But I know what I heard and felt. Someone or something whispered my name and touched me. I've worked a lot of seasonal jobs, but nothing has stayed with me like the summer I spent as a counselor at a camp in northern Michigan. I still catch myself thinking about it whenever I hear someone whistle at night. There was one rule every counselor was expected to enforce, even though none of us really understood why. Never whistle after lights out. It wasn't written on the camper handbook or posted anywhere. During orientation, the camp director mentioned it almost casually, like reminding us to keep food away from the cabins or make sure the fire was completely out before bed. If we heard a camper whistling after dark, we were supposed to stop it immediately. When I asked why, I was told it was just an old camp tradition, nothing more. The camp sat deep in the woods, nearly 40 minutes from the nearest town. Cell service barely existed, and once the sun disappeared behind the trees, the place felt completely cut off from the rest of the world. At night, all you could hear were insects, frogs from the lake, and the wind moving through the pines. The silence was one of the reasons parents loved sending their kids there. By my third week, I'd stopped thinking about the whistling rule altogether. Most of the campers followed directions without much trouble. Every night we'd finish the campfire, walk everyone back to their cabins, do one last head count, and settle into our own staff cabins for a few hours before sunrise came around again. Then one of the older campers decided the rule was stupid. It started during a flashlight game just before curfew. He gave a loud, exaggerated whistle while everyone laughed. One of the senior counselors immediately shut it down. Everyone rolled their eyes, including me. A few hours later, I woke up because I heard another whistle. It was faint. 3 short notes. It came from somewhere beyond the tree line. I remember lying there for a few seconds, assuming one of the kids had snuck out. Then another whistle answered. This one came from much farther away. The 2 sounds didn't overlap. They took turns, almost like someone was responding. By the time I got outside with my flashlight, everything was quiet. The cabins were locked. Nobody was wandering around. The next morning, I mentioned it during breakfast. One counselor shrugged and blamed birds. Another insisted foxes made strange noises at night. Neither explanation sat right with me. I'd spent enough time outdoors to know what birds sounded like. Those whistles didn't sound like birds. The following night passed without anything unusual. The night after that, it happened again. One whistle. A pause. Another whistle somewhere deeper in the woods. This time, several campers heard it too. They asked if another group was camping nearby. There wasn't. Our camp was the only property for miles. The director brushed it off and reminded everyone to stay inside after lights out. Nothing else. By then, I started noticing something else. Every morning there were footprints on the dirt path leading toward the woods. They always stopped just short of the cabins before turning back into the trees. Maintenance assumed they belonged to hikers. The nearest public trail was almost 6 miles away. A few nights later, heavy rain moved through the area. The kind that drenches everything for hours. I figured the weather would keep anyone out of the woods. Around 2 a.m, the whistle came again, closer this time. Close enough that I could tell it came from somewhere near the dining hall. Then another answered, right outside my cabin. I froze. The second whistle was so close, it sounded like whoever made it was standing just beyond the window. I didn't look. I don't know why. Something told me I shouldn't. Instead, I sat completely still until daylight. The rain had turned the ground into mud. Outside my cabin was a single set of fresh footprints. They led from the woods to my window, then back again. No other tracks. No signs anyone else had walked there. After that, none of us laughed about the rule anymore. The senior counselors organized late-night searches. We checked every trail, every storage building, every abandoned maintenance shed, but we found nothing. There was no evidence anyone had been living nearby, yet the whistles continued. Always after 2 a.m, always answered by another whistle somewhere else. The campers started getting nervous. A few claimed they heard someone walking between the cabins after lights out. Others said they woke up, thinking someone had been standing outside their windows. Nobody actually saw anyone. As the summer went on, more campers started talking about the whistles. Parents grew concerned after their kids came home describing strange noises outside their cabins. And despite extra patrols and searches of the woods, the camp never found anyone or anything that could explain them. Attendance slowly dropped over the next few years, and eventually the camp closed for good. Officially, it was because of declining enrollment. Maybe that's all it was. But after everything that happened, I still can't stop thinking about those whistles. I've spent years trying to come up with a logical explanation, and maybe there is one. I just don't know who was out there answering those whistles every single night.